This nation's military objective has always been to maintain peace by preventing war. This is neither a Democratic nor a Republican policy. It's supported by our allies. And most important of all, it's worked for nearly 40 years.
For 4.5 decades after World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a military standoff, with atomic weapons aimed at each other's cities. During that time, the US and its NATO allies refined the concept of deterrence, that is, discouraging aggression and maintaining a fragile balance of power.
It's usually a force structure that's located in a position or a place that will dissuade any country from doing anything that will upset the regional balance or the interests of a particular country. In this case, the United States and its allies.
After the Soviet Union imploded in 1991, the era of bipolar US-USSR rivalry ended. Many thought that deterrence would pass into history books with it.
A group of unidentified armed men have taken control of the regional government offices and the parliament building in Simferopol in the Crimea region of Ukraine.
America is officially calling a Russian invasion of Ukraine.
The latest security video revealing the moment that armed Russian sympathizers took over the parliament building in the Crimean capital.
When Russia annexed Crimea and started a proxy war in eastern Ukraine, the interest in deterrence was revived. But the old understanding of how to deter aggression did not necessarily fit the new global reality, methods, and adversaries.
So the PRC, North Korea, and the former Soviet Union, so Russia, are much more aligned today than they probably were over the past 30 years after the end of the Cold War. So their geostrategic interests, as they define them, seem to be much more aligned right now.
And one of China's core geostrategic interests is bringing sovereign Taiwan under its rule, against the wishes of the United States and the Taiwanese themselves.
祖国统一是历史必然，两岸同胞要携手同心，共享民族复兴的伟大荣光。
Chinese armed forces pressured Taiwan by sending ships and aircraft into surrounding areas, but stopped short of crossing into its territory. China also lays claim to the entire South China Sea, where its Coast Guard regularly clashes with Philippine vessels. But so far, they haven't used lethal force.
And we're seeing China taking some action, such as using water cannons, for instance, which are very much skirting the line of aggression, and the principle of aggression. And so, where does deterrence begin and end? In some cases, what we're seeing is that it kind of depends on what red line the partner or the U.S. wants to set.
Every 2 years, the United States invites its allies and partners to the world's largest naval exercise, the Rim of the Pacific, or RIMPAC. With 40 ships, 150 aircraft, and 25,000 personnel from 29 countries participating this year, the aim is to send a message of power and unity.
The thinking on deterrence has evolved in the 3 decades since the end of the Cold War, but its pillars remain the same. Clearly defined red lines, the power to enforce them, and the resolve to retaliate if the adversary fails to comply. And it's vessels like this one, the USS Carl Vinson, that are designed to project that power.
As impressive as this floating city is, it still brings to mind the old type of thinking on deterring conflicts. If deployed to counter the Chinese Coast Guard's water cannons in the South China Sea, would it avoid confrontation?
I worry about escalation. So I worry about the first shots being fired and then having a situation in which we are forced to respond or not respond with all the consequences that either choice would lead to. The point of RIMPAC and all these exercises is to prevent us from getting into that situation in the first place. And I again worry that we're not doing enough.
The concept of deterrence has evolved because we're facing a very different kind of challenge in the PRC, and it has broad claims to territorial waters, for instance, and it is willing to challenge them in a way that places are not necessarily accustomed to, such as these so-called gray zone tactics. Those have been common in much of the South China Sea. So how does the U.S. react to these more gray areas? That's a big part of what deterrence is now.
Initially, the United States and its partners hoped to deter Chinese aggression and expansion through diplomatic and economic means. The goal was to show that a peaceful world would bring more benefits than locking horns.
We were blinded, I think, by an overconfidence in our capabilities, as well as maybe a misunderstanding of the international dynamics by which certain countries were operating. In other words, we were led to believe that if we worked with China, that and particularly supported it economically, that eventually it would become a democracy and become a responsible player in world events. Unfortunately, that turned out not to be the case.
Now, the focus seems to be shifting towards building wide alliances and relying on local partners to block unwanted actions in their own backyards.
I think moving forward, we will have to rely a lot more on our allies to essentially share much of the deterrence and defense burden, because the United States, even though we can still do a lot, can't do everything on its own. And I think what you'll see is a lot more rebalancing of roles and responsibilities towards our European allies.
But while NATO can provide that alliance framework in Europe, in Asia it has to be built almost from scratch.
In East Asia, you don't have any regional framework that can deal with a potential threat or challenge. You have individual alliances. In recent years, there's been a growth in dialogues, but there's nothing formally binding those countries together. So we're transitioning basically from a hub and spokes approach to more cooperative approach, but we're not there yet.
We have a balance of power that is shifting, not necessarily in our favor, and so even though we're doing good things, I think that we're not doing enough good things and not fast enough.
And the United States is not the only country building alliances.
PRC, along with Russia, I might add, has been trying to work with these global south countries in order to, in a sense, forge an alternative world order so they can become less vulnerable to the US's ability to deter them through financial measures.
Because of Taiwan's international standing, it doesn't get invited to exercises like RIMPAC. Constantly in China's crosshairs, the nation must bolster its own abilities to deter a potential Chinese invasion. And many say it needs to do so in better ways.
Taiwan needs to spend a lot more than it is spending right now, and it needs to spend a lot more wisely. And by that I mean that the focus should be asymmetric warfare capabilities. I don't think Taiwan needs big ticket items. It needs to focus on what will help delay an invasion, for instance, just because this is the best use of its dollars.
Although the United States is not an official ally of Taiwan, it is legally obligated to provide the nation with what it needs to defend itself under the Taiwan Relations Act.
There's been a concern that we were not providing Taiwan with the right kinds of weapons that it would actually need in order to deter an invasion. They didn't necessarily need the kinds of field weaponry that might look cool, for instance, but not necessarily be useful for basically running an asymmetric campaign to deter a large-scale invasion. But what we have seen from the PRC more recently in response to actions from Taiwan that it does not like is that an invasion might not be what it has in mind. They might instead choose the blockade option. And so if we are not prepared essentially to deter the right thing, then that functionally undermines the concept of deterrence, even if it doesn't change the theoretical definition of it.
There is a remedy, though, to be able to help Taiwan. First and foremost is for Taiwan to increase its defense readiness, increasing its defense budget, making smarter purchases for its military, things like that. But the other thing that I think is most important right now is for the international community to step up and commit to helping Taiwan.
But that help must come in a form that fits a world of blurry boundaries, novel tactics, and complex international relationships. And Cold War era weapons like those on display at RIMPAC may not be the best tools for the job of maintaining peace and preventing war.